All right, I see our attendee number has kind of leveled out here, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to our informational drought meeting for county executive staff. We're very excited that you're here with us today. We've got a lot to cover, so we'll get right into it. All right. Just going to go over our agenda here before we get started with our presentations. All right. So we have quite a lot to cover, as I said. We're going to start out by hearing from Carla Namath, the Director of DWR, and Joaquin Escobar, who is the Chair of the State Water Board, to give opening remarks. Then the State Water Board and DWR will present together on financial assistance that's available and how to access it. Then Ryan Burris from the Office of Emergency Services, or Cal OES, will cover how to coordinate with county OES offices. Then we'll hear about provisions from the recent executive drought order. And finally, a discussion about the upcoming activities that are related to Sb552. And we'll adjourn by 4 p.m. today. Okay, and just a couple quick meeting logistics for everyone who's here on Zoom. So you'll see on your toolbar at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A feature. So you can click that and use that to ask questions or provide comments throughout the presentations. And we'll either respond to your question in the chat box itself or live during the meeting. And if you wish to speak, you can use the raised hand function in the Zoom toolbar, and we can grant you permission to unmute yourself once you're called upon. And then finally, the meeting is being recorded today, and it will be made available online on the county solicitation page. And we'll also post the slides there as well, because there's a lot of links and really valuable information in our presenter slides today. All right, yes, and someone already asked, will the slide deck be provided? Yes, it will be. We'll make sure that's posted either tomorrow or early next week. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic over to Carla.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We've got a lot of important information to share about how we're going to work through our third consecutive dry year when we're all really stressed by drought. So I just want to open by acknowledging how critical the partnership is between the state of California and local governments, particularly counties. And I am joined by my colleague, State Water Resources Control Board Chair, Joaquin Escobar. For me, what's really helpful about our state administration and our organization around drought response is how well the Department of Water Resources is working with our colleagues at the Water Board. We have a lot of shared responsibilities, particularly when we have these very challenging conditions. And so one of our goals is to present more of a unified approach to you all at the county level to really simplify the work that you need to do to access state resources. I don't need to tell you all that we had the driest wet season on record. January, February, and March was extraordinarily dry this year. And not only was it a record beater, but we really beat the previous dry record like twofold. The previous precipitation, low precipitation record was about 15 inches during that January, February, March period, which is the heart of our wet season here in California. And this past year, we only saw 5.6 inches of precipitation. So not only was it the driest on record, but it was the driest on record by a long shot. And that has created very challenging conditions for all of us as we head into, in particular, into these summer months. As you are also aware, the governor has issued several executive orders since declaring a drought emergency, first at a regional level about a year ago, and then it gradually expanded to the entire state. There is a lot of work underway urging Californians to conserve water. We do have a 15% voluntary conservation call from the governor, but the governor has also mandated, and I know the Water Board will touch on this a little bit later in the presentation, but he has also mandated that local water districts activate their drought shortage contingency plans, which does include mandatory conservation measures for Californians. We are very focused this year on working with local water districts to implement conservation and approaches to drought management that make sense in their own communities based on investments they've made in water supply reliability and based on local conditions. And so that we really do need that to work. We need that to work better than it's been working to date. Thus the intensified effort to get Californians to really conserve. Conservation is not the way out of a drought. It does help, but we know that we need to be preparing for much longer duration droughts, and that requires us to reinvest in our systems. A lot of that work is already underway, particularly for more rural counties. California, the Department of Water Resources did some significant work on identifying risk for drought, particularly for smaller rural communities in California. That has very much anchored our resource distribution to date, meaning the $200 million that the department had to help support small communities. It's that kind of legwork that we did as a result of the previous drought, often in direct consultation with the counties, has really helped shape our drought response thus far, and it will continue to do so. So again, this partnership between the state agencies and the counties is just crucial to helping us manage both through the immediate drought impacts and then get our communities onto a more resilient track overall. So you're going to hear some new tools that I think are really exciting in terms of urging counties to self-report where we have some dry well problems. That is going to help the department, together with the Water Board, be more prepared to pre-position our resources in the event that we do need to provide emergency supplies. So we don't know when this intense drought period is going to end. We are currently starting to prepare, at least for the State Water Project, and other parties throughout the state are starting to prepare for a potential fourth dry year. And one of the things we learned in the previous drought is that the more we can do upfront planning and preparing, the better off we'll be in terms of protecting our communities, protecting our economy, and in protecting our ecosystem from the ravages of drought. So I want to thank you all in advance for spending this time with us. We know that your time is valuable, and we are certainly here fully staffed to answer any questions that you have. And this is really a partnership as we move through these warm summer months and into the potential realities of a dry year next year. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Water Resources Control Board Chair Joaquin Esquivel. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Namath. Really appreciate and really plus up your comments around the incredible cooperation that's going on between our agencies and how it's really central to our ability to better support you all in the hard tasks at the county level that you have on your shoulders. Because I know it's not just drought, it's also wildfires. It's also continuing to respond to COVID. And so here, drought, and importantly, not just drought in this moment, but increased aridification and increased moments, as Carla said, where we'll experience conditions like this and have to continue to lean on the good work that we continue to do in this year and know that we can always continue to improve and do better. I think of the last drought in in the height in 2014 and 2015, when we didn't have so many of the programs that we had this last year, programs that we'll continue to talk to you all about here that support domestic wells, state smalls, the hardest to reach oftentimes in emergency fashion in communities even as we at the state board with DWR are focused as well as on community water systems that are 15 connections or larger, and that we have a tighter hold on and can help be watching those challenges with those systems and also responding to them. But really, these county programs that support domestic wells and state smalls are what we didn't certainly have in the last drought, and where we fell short oftentimes. And where I'm proud that this drought, we were able to respond. And although we haven't been able to respond to everyone, and here again, expanding these programs is critical to that, because we're seeing not just drought conditions and really dry well issues in the San Joaquin and the Tulare and places that we saw in our last drought, but certainly also now in the Sacramento. And so the ability to expand these programs, to have them in place so that either through service providers or you, the counties yourselves, who can staff up on these agreements, because we can make them multi-year, we can help provide you the capacity you need to be able to respond to local conditions, is just really paramount and different. And here continues to be a really important tool that you'll hear more about. But for me is also a sign of the evolution that we're all embarking on when it comes to managing these challenging conditions throughout the state. And here need to continue to realize that we can't just always respond in emergency fashion to drought. That it is here a function that we're all trying to do is really drought management as opposed to drought emergencies. And that requires us to have these programs, to have these relationships, and to all of us have, and regrettably will need, the muscle memory on how to respond to our communities, how to assess the evolving challenges that the drought will face, but so will flood and other challenges out there. But here, really knowing that we haven't and are still in the middle of developing and creating that right balance during these drought years in which we're challenged. I'm here actually in the Coachella Valley right now, where I grew up, my childhood home, where yesterday I had the pleasure of touring around with Regional Administrator Martha Guzman, along with CVWD and electeds in the Eastern Coachella Valley, to look at water quality challenges there. And reminds me of the critical role that counties play, where Riverside County was an important partner in that discussion. And here it's always a continuum for all of our communities, whether it's on the state, federal, or local level of government. People just expect results. People, although complicated as things may be, we can all have a common outcome and vision, and here it's supporting communities. And so whether it's the 2,200 households that are already being provided water now on a monthly basis, or the many more homes that we know these programs will likely have to support coming into this summer, we're here to be responsive, and just really appreciate and thank you, as Director Namath did, around your continued commitment and collaboration. So thanks, and we won't belabor things, and we'll get to our actual technical experts that can start to dive into the programs, but really appreciate your time.
Great, thank you so much, Chair Esquivel and Director Namath. We really appreciate you being here today and for really emphasizing the importance of us all coming together and preparing and in advance as we can for drought impacts that are going to be inevitable this summer. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move into our presentations. Our first presenter today is going to be Stephen Springhorn from DWR, who's going to talk about Drywell and Groundwater tools for drought response and planning. All right, take it away, Stephen.
All right, thank you, Molly. Good afternoon, everyone. As Molly mentioned, my name is Stephen Springhorn, and I work for the California Department of Water Resources in our Sustainable Groundwater Management Office, and I'm a member of our DWR drought team. And as this picture shows, as you all know, we're continuing to experience our drought conditions, and Director Namath and Chair Esquivel summed it up very well, that as we see limited snowpack and surface water, the majority of the water users in California turn to our drought buffer, which is our groundwater basins. And so because of that increased reliance on groundwater and additional pumping in times of drought, we have been seeing the impacts that were just described to shallow domestic wells, in some areas land subsidence and other impacts. And so in order to really try to continue, as mentioned, the partnership and assist and support you all at the counties and the other entities doing the drought response and planning efforts that you're all doing, we have been coordinating at the technical level between DWR, the State Water Board, Cal OES, and other state agencies to compile as many drought relevant data sets and develop tools from that data set. So it's not just dumping data, but it's also putting context around that data to make it most useful to solve problems on the ground, which you all are faced with. So we're going to highlight a couple of drought tools today. Many of these tools did not exist or have been significantly enhanced from the last drought, severe drought of 2012 to 2016. And some of these tools are brand new just very recently. So we want to make sure you're all aware of these tools. And the theme that Director Namath and Chair Escobar mentioned at the beginning is this partnership, and one really strength of the partnership so far, and we really want to continue that, is feedback, because these tools are only as good as the benefits they provide to you all. And so we want to make sure we're still hearing feedback and how we could be developing new tools or modifying the tools you'll see today to make them most useful or applicable. And we have been doing that, and some of these tools we will show today have been updated based on your feedback. So we really appreciate that. All right, so we'll jump into the next slide, please. Okay, so many of you are aware and work through these different pillars of drought management every day. And so just trying to put a framework around these different tools, where they may be useful or where we've seen them being used already, is the different pillars of monitoring and early warning, mitigation and preparedness and response in the heat of the drought, and then vulnerability and impact assessments to make sure we're preparing for future droughts, as the chair and director mentioned. So we also are trying to make sure you all have the links and know where to get this information. And so probably one of the best links to remember is drought.ca.gov. That has all of the information that I'll talk about today and much more. And so that's a key one. And as mentioned, we'll share these slides, and these hyperlinks go right to the content that we'll be talking about. And then more on the policy space that sort of connects these three pillars are drinking water well principles and strategies. This came out of a governor's drought executive order where it tasked the department in coordination with the state board, water board, to come up with, through a engagement process with drinking water principles and strategies. So this is more of an umbrella set of principles and strategies, and it has an implementation plan that's all online at this link. And a lot of these efforts tools that I'll describe today are going to further those drinking water principles and strategies. And then, as mentioned, there's many drought executive orders that are really guiding us to do these activities that we're talking about. Next, please. So on the monitoring and early warning. So I'll be covering these three topics here, and really want to make sure that, and some of these are very new, so we want to make sure you're aware of them. So through a drought executive order, there's a new California Water Watch that is really a clearinghouse for the latest and greatest overall water conditions in California. Then there's a more groundwater specific that's connected to the Water Watch, but it's focused on groundwater, and that's California's Groundwater Live. And then the newest element is just being released essentially now, and that's the dry domestic well susceptibility, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Next. So then, as we transition from the ability to much better see what the current state of the conditions are and drought impacts, and start to get a sense of putting that data together and the conditions and the status together to start to get early warning, then we go into and are much better prepared for the response, because we can be staging, as Director Namath mentioned, and outreaching to where we're seeing in the communities that might need it most. And so that's really where the Drywell reporting system that was born out of the 2012 to 2016 drought, but it's been significantly enhanced and I'll touch on that today. And then based on where we see actual dry well reports coming in, that's where the drought assistance comes in. And my colleagues and fellow presenters today will go into a lot of detail on that assistance. And then next. And then finally, going over to the vulnerability and impact assessment, which is more on that longer term drought planning side, with the water shortage vulnerability and drought planning in that predated and now is accelerated under Sb552. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so the four topics I'll cover are, as I mentioned. Okay, so now, as mentioned, California Water Watch, it's new as earlier this year, it was launched, and it's really the state's clearinghouse for statewide and very local, and you can even type in your address, water conditions. It has up-to-date drought information, and it's updated daily. So and really important thing that we want to stress is not just a link to where to go get information, but what are some of the use cases that you can use this information for your local response and planning. So this is really a great way to understand and communicate to your communities the current and changing conditions, whether they be drought or pretty much any water condition, because it's all on this site at a statewide level, but also a very local level. Next. So then as we go to more groundwater focused, California's Groundwater Live is a new site that is compiling all of the vast information that's coming into us from the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which has generated a tremendous amount of new or better information on groundwater since our last severe drought. You can search by your county, by the groundwater basins in your county, or even your address to get the latest on groundwater levels, wells, so that's domestic, irrigation, public supply, and dry wells, and subsidence. And then this site is updated weekly. So this has some use cases around Executive Order Action 9 well permitting that will be discussed later today. It also allows you to track better than ever before the groundwater conditions in your area of interest and start to see where there might be impacts. And then it's been instrumental in groundwater sustainability planning and implementation of those local groundwater sustainability plans. Next. And then finally, the newest tool is our dry domestic well susceptibility. And so like the other tools mentioned, you're able to search by your county, groundwater basin, or address. And we'll go into more details of how we're calculating this, but essentially it's taking the latest live information we've got on the latest, the domestic wells in the state of California, overlaying that with the latest groundwater trends across the state, and turning that into a susceptibility map of where domestic wells may go dry. So you can start to see within your county down to within a square mile where you might have pockets of susceptibility for dry wells. And then you can use that to then plan and procure information and assistance and add your local knowledge about emergency response to those dry wells, as well as the drought and groundwater planning efforts that are going. This can play into that. And then the longer term drinking water planning projects and assistance through the projects or the programs like SAFER and other very big initiatives that are happening in California. Next. So with each one of these tools, I'll quickly go through it and just highlight some of the key features. There's many more than I'll be able to share today, but we have links here, and Molly's been doing a great job to add the links. So please check these out. So when you come into California Water Watch, there's information about drought, the latest drought information, and then there's a window that shows statewide conditions on precip, temperature, reservoirs, snowpack, groundwater, stream flow, and soil and vegetation. So you can click through each one of those and you're going to get up to the day information on all these different indicators or information. However, if you want to take that statewide knowledge and then go to your area of interest, in many places, as we know, it's very location specific. And next click, please. You can type in your address or search on an interactive map, and you can get to the address what are the latest conditions on precip and temperature and some other key information about what are the local groundwater sustainability agencies and other information like that. So I think it's a very nice statewide to very local tool that puts everything in your hands, and you can use that for informing your communities or citizens. Next. So then quickly touching on California's Groundwater Live. So this launched late last year in the fall. It's been a way for us to organize and make better access to all of the groundwater information we've had in the past and that we're getting now under SGMA, as mentioned. So it has different dashboards from the statewide level, just broad look at what groundwater levels our conditions are looking like, and no surprise that when there's less surface water, there's more groundwater pumping, and about 65% of our groundwater monitoring stations are showing that groundwater levels are below normal. Next, please. So then there's different categories of different groundwater data. So groundwater level, you have different ways to look at the groundwater levels, from what is the most recent measurement compared to the period of record of that well, the 1, 3, 5, and 10-year trends in groundwater levels at a particular area, and then the long-term 20-year trend to see overall what is the trend doing in groundwater levels in that particular area. Next, please. So then what you can do is you can search across the state, next, or your county or groundwater specific area of interest. So you can select your county, and it'll automatically update the statistics based on your county. And so you can see for your county, what are the groundwater level conditions? And so you can use that for planning or presentations that you're meeting with your communities. And then the final way you can use this tool is you can actually type in an address and get what are the groundwater conditions on water levels in your neighborhood. Next slide, please. So then another element of this that's featured on California's Groundwater Live is well infrastructure information. So just like the dams and canals and everything on the surface water, wells are our groundwater infrastructure. And so this Department of Water Resources is the steward of all the well completion reports that come in California. So anytime any type of well is drilled, the drillers have to submit that to DWR. And so we've always had that ability, or we've always had that database, but back when SGMA passed in 2014, before that, all that information was confidential. So over time, there's been big milestone moments where more information has been legally able to be shared. And so we've been trying to move with that trend and get this information much more easily accessible. I will note that this information that's presented is no personal information. It is on here, it's redacted. However, as counties and local agencies, you can get access to all of the information if you need it. So this is more for public consumption, where the information, the owner information, is redacted. So we have a dashboard that shows the total number of the different types of wells: domestic, irrigation, public supply, working with our colleagues at the Water Board on those community systems, and reported dry wells in our databases. And then how many of those well completion reports have come into DWR year to date. So you can see there's been almost 900 domestic wells drilled year to date, and 417 irrigation wells, and 92 dry wells in the last 30 days. And so there's a little new flag at the bottom of that, and that's the dry well susceptibility. But before we go there, there's a couple more things I just wanted to show. So for each one of these types of wells, there's a specific dashboard that shows the trends, the depths, and you can search these just like the other one, groundwater levels by county, groundwater basin, and address. And all this information gets updated, these statistics get updated for your area of interest. So on the irrigation wells, next, domestic wells, next, and then dry wells. So what you can see, and you can zoom all the way in, and you can actually get to the PDF well completion report if you need to. So we're trying to give the information across the state, the region, and the local level. Okay, next. All right, so then one element, the new element of well infrastructure is about what are the trends and what is the possibility of these domestic wells in particular of going dry. So this is the newest tool that's been developed. Some of the use cases here, as mentioned, Executive Order Action 9, drought emergency response and assistance providing, and drought and drinking water planning. Next. So how we come up with this actual deliverable or outcome is we take all of the domestic well, all the domestic wells in the state, which there's over 270,000 of them. A key note though is that over half of those 270,000 domestic wells are outside groundwater basins. So we have to keep in mind that although this analysis is within groundwater basins because we're using groundwater levels, it's important to keep in mind that those folks that live outside groundwater basins could be susceptible, and there's a high concentration and density, as you can see on the map, of domestic wells in the foothills along the Sierra Nevada and the Central Coast and North Coast. Okay, and then what we do is we combine the latest look at domestic wells, so this is a live link to our database, to then the latest information we have from our groundwater levels coming from Sigma and coming from other reporting programs. And so we see those trends and we overlay that and we get, next click please, is this susceptibility down to the square mile. So on an interactive map, you can zoom into any area of interest and you can click on any of those colored areas. So the darker the color, the higher density of wells that are susceptible to going dry. The gray areas have domestic wells in them. However, based on the current conditions, as far as the data we have, it's not showing that wells are susceptible. And so you can click and look at your area and see what the susceptibility is. So that's where in your county, you can see that there's some areas that are showing lower susceptibility and some areas that are showing much higher susceptibility. So you could tailor outreach or assistance in these areas. And that's something we've been doing at the state, is we've been tailoring our outreach and asks for funding for assistance based on this tool as well. And next click, please. And so working with the state board, our technical team has been thinking of different reference layers to put over the top to try and add context and inform decision-making. And one that we wanted to highlight is, or two actually, is so the susceptibility map shows where wells could go dry based on data-driven analysis. But then we overlay where we've actually received dry well reports to ground truth it and to test it and calibrate. And you can see a very good correlation between where the method is showing susceptibility to where we've received actual dry well reports. And then those green polygons are from our colleagues at the Water Board of the water system boundaries. And you can see it's no surprise that many of the areas right outside the service area boundaries or community or public water system boundaries, we have high susceptibility. And so there's been discussions about, okay, this is helping us inform these decisions being made on in other areas of how we can reduce the overall number of community or dry well owners or well owners at risk. So next slide, please. So I just encourage you to check that out. If you have ideas of different layers or different ways to look at the information, we are all ears because this is a new product. We know we're going to be needing to evolve it through time in the team we have with DWR and the Water Board, but we're looking to be wanting to get it into your hands this summer. Okay, so then the last tool I'd like to highlight is the Drywell reporting system. This has been around for a while, but it's been updated. So there's a public form in English and Spanish, no sign-in required to submit a Drywell report. There's been roughly 4,000 Drywell reports submitted since this system went online back in 2014. And as mentioned, we've seen 92 Drywell reports submitted through here in the last 30 days. So there's resources for homeowners and counties on this site. And then there's statewide and county data summaries that you can see what has been set up. So not a lot has changed on the front end of this tool, but the enhancements have really been on the back side. Next slide, please. And that is to connect all of you at the county levels or your key staff that are assisting dry well owners, domestic well owners, and setting up accounts so that as soon as a dry well report comes into this tool, an email gets sent to that person at the county or other assistance providers, so they know exactly when that happens. So we're shortening the path from the time the person is in need to the time that assistance can be provided. So we've been working with our colleagues at the Water Board, Cal OES, and Drywell assistance providers. And so we've been signing folks up over the last number of weeks. So we currently have 26 counties covered, whether they're county officials that have an account here, or non-governmental organizations like self-help enterprises that's working in 10 counties in the San Joaquin Valley. They're connected to the system too and using it every day. And so those 26 counties represent about 90% of the dry wells that have been reported since this tool has been created. So we are getting a really good return rate on our outreach, and really appreciate your staff at the counties signing up and utilizing this tool. So for more information on this tool and how to get your county staff, technical staff or assistant staff signed up, you can email that and we can get you connected. So with that, my last slide here is just the different the links that we talked about. And so feel free to look through these. If you have feedback, please provide that. Thank you for all the hard work you're all doing on the ground. All right, that concludes my presentation. And I'm going to turn it over to Megan Tosney from the Water Board to talk about financial assistance. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Really quickly, we have someone with a hand up in our attendee list. Melissa, did you have a question for Stephen? It looks like we have a couple questions here. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, so. Oh, looks like she put her hand down. Okay, take it away, Megan.
Okay.
So sorry. We have Douglas with his hand up. Oh my gosh, they keep appearing and disappearing.
Okay.
We'll come back at the end of Megan's presentation if you have a question for Megan.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm Megan Tosney. I'm an Assistant Deputy Director in our Division of Financial Assistance at the State Water Board. Today, I'm going to be focusing primarily on an overview of our countywide and regional funding program, which is geared toward addressing drought and water quality issues for households that are served by state small water systems and domestic wells. So next slide, Molly. So I'm going to primarily cover, a quick summary of some of our existing regional programs that serve similar purposes, a status update on applications that we have in from some of the priority counties that we've been targeting. Then I'll go over some high-level program eligibilities and key next steps for counties to apply for this program. And then I'll just cover some general links and resources at the end. So next slide, Molly. So this map shows some of the existing statewide programs or regional programs that we have funded through the State Water Board that can address either drought or water quality issues for state smalls and domestic wells. Things like bottled water, hauled water, also well replacement and repair activities. And, you can see it's focused primarily in the San Joaquin Valley. And so really our goal with this program is to try to help counties set up programs to assist the rest of the state. And so next slide, Molly. So this is a list of state agencies that state agencies are using to track some of the counties that appear most likely to have significant drought impacts this summer. And you can see here in the right-hand column that about half of them already are covered by existing programs that are funded by either the State Board or DWR. Some of those are pretty limited, focused primarily on water hauling, for example. And then for those that are not covered, there's about 8 of those. We are in discussions currently with staff from each of those counties regarding submitting proposals. Those are Lake, Shasta, Siskiyou, Sonoma, Tehama, San Luis Obispo, and Tuolumne. And so, you know, this is kind of a helpful way for us to have been targeting our outreach, but I also want to acknowledge that there's going to be drought impacts in, you know, many other counties, and make it clear that we are accepting applications from all counties at this time. The other thing I wanted to emphasize is that I know we're going to be covering later some more of the new drought planning requirements that are coming up with Sb552. And so I'm, you know, concerned that some counties may be thinking like, well, I need more time to sort of plan my approach, and I'm not really ready to apply for funding. And we just want to emphasize that it does take time for us to process applications, approve funding, and execute agreements so that we're able to reimburse for eligible costs. So we strongly encourage, if you know there are specific areas in your county that you want to be able to respond to this summer, to go ahead and submit a proposal, and then funding permitting, we can consider, you know, a subsequent proposal down the road to amend your existing agreement and add scope or budget. And I think that's it for this one, Molly. So again, just to kind of high level summarize the types of projects and work that we can fund under these programs. You know, today we're mostly focused on drought, but these programs can cover both water quality and drought needs. And the programs can be tailored to your given, you know, county or region. So we can do things like domestic well testing, then, you know, response with bottled or hauled water. We've had some instances where it makes sense to do like a kiosk filling station approach. Other areas where we've implemented point of use and point of entry treatment on, you know, the individual household wells. And then we're also trying to strongly encourage counties to consider including in their proposals assistance with implementing long-term solutions like well repairs and replacement. Ultimately, providing hauled water is quite expensive, and so we're, you know, wanting to encourage folks to help households get to the long-term solutions as well. And definitely, of course, in cases where there is, you know, nearby infrastructure to connect to a public water system, we're strongly encouraging that as well. And that can be covered under these agreements also. Next slide. So as far as the eligible recipients for this program, primarily we've been looking at counties or nonprofits that are interested in implementing on behalf of one or more counties. We're also willing to look at other approaches, like if there's a public agency that might want to implement on behalf of one or more counties, maybe a GSA or whatever the case may be, you know, we're willing to consider those as well. Again, I already mentioned, but just to kind of reemphasize, the grants are intended to provide assistance primarily to state smalls that are serving a disadvantaged community or domestic wells serving low-income households. There are some services that we may potentially have some latitude to provide regardless of income, like well sampling or also bottled and hauled water. So if those are, you know, of interest to you, I would just work case by case with the folks that are reviewing your application, and we may be able to accommodate that on a case by case basis. The only other thing I wanted to mention here is just to emphasize that we do also have other funding sources available to help public water systems when they need to respond to emergencies like an outage or whatever the case may be. And so that's why they're not necessarily expected to be part of these county programs, because we can directly fund those public water systems as part of other programs. Next slide, Molly. So just kind of high level what the next steps are for counties or partner entities that are interested in applying. Definitely go to our website. There's information there that's much more detailed than what I've gone through today as far as, you know, eligibility requirements and how to set up proposals and budgets and all of that. All applications come through our financial assistance application submittal tool, or FAST. And then once everything has been submitted, our staff will present a funding recommendation to our DFA Deputy Director for approval. Once that's approved, eligible costs can start being incurred, but we can't actually reimburse until we get the grant agreement executed, which can take typically anywhere from like 3 to 6 months. So that's just something to consider as far as like planning for cash flow and that sort of thing. One other thing I wanted to mention here too is that we've set up a mechanism to, we have, as I mentioned earlier, a pretty robust existing program in the San Joaquin Valley that's run by self-help enterprises. And so we've set up a way to fund self-help to do sort of like one-on-one consultation with counties or partner entities that are putting together proposals, because they have, you know, just a lot of, you know, implementation strategies and lessons learned that they are willing to share and want to help counties to develop, you know, strong proposals that are going to be implementable. And so if that's something that you're interested in, I definitely recommend that folks take advantage of it. And if Molly, can you go to the next slide? The best way to request that is through Matt Pavlicek. He's the program manager, and his contact info is here, as well as the link again to the website for the program. And then I just have one more slide, Molly. So, you know, I wanted to also highlight a couple other programs that may be relevant for folks working on these county programs. Number one, our technical assistance program, which allows us to provide assistance through third-party providers that can help with developing more of the longer-term solutions, particularly if there's an area where domestic wells can be consolidated into an existing water system. You know, often there's a fair amount of planning and engineering, you know, different agreements that need to be developed and that sort of thing. And so we have TA providers available to help with that. And I provided the email address here for how to get in touch with those folks to request technical assistance if you encounter a need. We also, of course, have you know, funding available for implementing those long-term solutions primarily through our Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And, you know, I provided a couple of links here as well on how to access those programs. And just, you know, although it hasn't been the focus of the presentation today, I did want to mention that we have a lot of grant opportunities right now for public water systems that may want to apply to implement projects for drought resiliency. So definitely encourage, you know, folks to share that information out to individuals that are working at public water systems. And I think that's all I have for right now. I will refer this over to Art Inahosa from DWR, unless there's any questions that we need to take, Molly.
I don't see any right now.
Okay. Yeah, and I can respond to these couple more detailed questions in the Q&A box.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right. On to you, Art.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us here today. My name is Arthur Inahosa. I'm with the Department of Water Resources Division of Regional Assistance. My shop oversees our financial assistance efforts for a lot of what the department offers financial assistance for, everything except flood for the most part. We're also comprised of 4 regional offices located in Glendale, Fresno, West Sacramento, and Red Bluff. We have staff, engineers, scientists, and technicians and analysts located in all 4 of those areas to help support the regional and local needs across the state. Next slide. Today I want to focus on sort of continue on with what Megan was talking about in terms of funding. Last year, and the governor's budget passed by the legislature afforded $500 million for drought relief. It was broken down into 3 parts: urban community drought relief, multi-benefit drought relief, and small community drought relief. And the department administered these 3 pots in essentially 2 programs. We combined the urban and multi-benefit pots of money into 1 program, and we kept the small community drought relief separate. And I'm happy to say that it was successful, or perhaps I should say, unfortunately, it was very successful, and that there was a lot of need there. And for the most part, all those funds have been appropriated or allocated out to projects across the state. However, the current budget as proposed, the May revised, includes more money for these efforts. It includes $200 million more for the urban drought relief. There's another $75 million specifically for water conservation efforts. There's $15 million for county drought planning, another $75 million for turf replacement efforts, $100 million for drought relief for the small communities, plus another 21 specifically to support acquisition and disbursement of tanks for water hauling programs, and $25 million for water conservation for small communities. Like I said, this is in the proposed budget. We hope it all goes through, but there's still a lot to happen in the budget process. So we'll see what comes to the final budget at the end of the next month. Next slide. So as I mentioned, most of the money, if not all of it, has already been allocated from this past year. We expect to continue on with these programs with the coming year with the funds that I just highlighted. The programs by and large will likely continue as they were, with some tweaks that we expect based on some of the things that we learned over the last year, as well as any potential tweaks that the legislation itself might direct for the funds. But assuming things continue, this is kind of what we would like to expect. For the small communities, we continue to continue on as we were. As Megan alluded to, some of our efforts can be used for the emergency measures such as hauled water, water tanks, bottled water, vending machines, interties, things that are real quick, real emergency, where something goes wrong, breaks, and it needs a fix. We can help with that. These are done in terms of grants, which means an agreement is entered into, and then for the most part, it's a reimbursable type of payments. There are some provisions, depending on the program and the need, for advance pay. We didn't see any of that this last round, though. We're also funding near-term and resilient infrastructure projects, things to improve water supply sources or improve the conveyance therein, storage. We've seen a lot of projects just replacing things that are just breaking down or become super vulnerable, either to age or to fire in a lot of cases as well. And we've seen things like backup power supplies. So the event that rolling blackouts affect a community, they've got a way of keeping at least their water pressure up during those times. And as I think most of you are probably familiar, they can, when things get bad, they can last for days, and that can have a serious impact on your local water supply systems or just individual pumps. Next slide. On the urban side, this program was a little more involved in terms of its application process, not the application process itself, but the overall implementation of the program. Similarly, we had the availability to support more urgent needs, such as water tanks, machines, vending machines, interties, bottled water, hauled water. And similarly, we supported new wells and rehabilitation of existing wells, and all sorts of improvements to infrastructure and capital improvements to water delivery systems. The multi-benefit component also afforded projects that helped fish and wildlife efforts that were also suffering from drought. Next slide. So we kept the applicants pretty broad. They could be public agencies such as counties and cities. Utilities were eligible, special districts, schools, community service districts, irrigation districts, flood control districts, reclamation districts, colleges and universities. Well, you can read the rest here. Not too many people weren't eligible by and large. One of the most critical factors was who benefited from the project. That was our big, for instance, in the small community drought relief project, it was not who applied, but rather who recognized the benefits. So if a large entity had a small community that was part of it, it could still apply for money for that small community's benefit. Next slide. What could you do with these monies? Well, a reasonable cost of study. Sometimes, large capital projects already have studies done, so that wouldn't be necessary. But to the extent that something sudden happens and a quick analysis needs to happen on how to repair or improve upon it, that would be a reasonable cost of study. The engineering and design work that goes into a capital project, the actual construction, of course, and any other work directly related to the project itself. Planning efforts for long-term drought were typically not considered eligible unless they tied in very closely to the project implementation. Next slide. So there we go. Our priorities in 2021 for urban and multi-benefit grants, typically we're looking at emergency projects, and we were looking at projects that had most of their permitting completed. As you can appreciate, sometimes capital improvement projects require a lot of front work, a lot of planning and permitting. As these funds were emergency funds and had a relatively limited lifespan compared to, say, bond funds, which can last for a decade, these had about 3 years to expend things. So we were looking for projects that were pretty much ready to go. As I mentioned before, in the urban side, we could front 25% of a grantee's needs should they be able to demonstrate a cash flow issue. We, as a concurrence agency, did not need to worry about CEQA, which is not to say that the applicant didn't. We did try to push or set aside money specifically for a disadvantaged community involvement program, which we had already going through our IRWIN process. And we piggybacked on that to help move some of the disadvantaged community benefit money out a little faster than it might have otherwise done by leveraging existing agreements. And on the small community drought relief side, it was pretty much first come, first serve. We received, I think, all told over 300, almost 400 when all said and done, applications for $200 million worth of available funds. And that's one of the reasons why, while they're all gone, the small communities were defined as those that are served by or by a supplier that has less than 3,000 connections, in case you were wondering where that differentiation came from. And as you've heard all my predecessors speak to, we did this in close coordination with the Water Board. Some of the projects that we funded came from their applications, if you will, to move things into our stream. Other things that came to us, we deferred to the Water Board. They got to see everything that we were processing so that we made sure we didn't trip on anything, double count somebody, or send someone down a path that would have maybe been a short-term gain, but a long-term loss in terms of long-term viability or resilience. Next slide. So you've seen some of these links already. Drought.ca.gov is an easy place to get to find out all sorts of resources to help support with drought. The California Water Watch link is another great place to find the data and links to further data that Stephen spoke to. You're going to hear later from one of my colleagues, Fethi Benjama, about Sb552 in particular. I mentioned briefly the $15 million for county drought support that's in the proposed budget starting this fiscal year here, 22-23. The survey that Fethi's going to employ to respond to will help us decide and guide how to avail that funding source. What's the best? What do you guys need to help make your responses work the best? So we haven't prescribed exactly how we want to use that money yet. We'd like to hear from you, get a sense of what's out there, what's needed, so that the programs we roll out are as beneficial as possible. If you're curious about more information about our small community drought relief program or our urbans, there's the email links that go to our staff as well. You can get to those as well from our web pages. Also, as an aside, if you're interested in funding opportunities beyond drought and beyond what the Water Board offers for the water aspect, there's a real handy website that the state of California runs out of the library, actually. Grants, grants.ca.gov. It's sort of a one-stop shop to find out what any state agency is offering in terms of financial assistance. You'll find all of the board stuff there. You'll find all of our stuff there. It's pretty handy place if you are interested in financial support beyond the water sector, we've talked about here today. And that pretty much wraps it up for me. I was trying to keep it short today, but as with the rest of the group, I'll be happy to answer questions when the time comes. Otherwise, I'll pass it over to Ryan or Robert over at OES.
Hey, apologies for that. Thank you, Art. Robert Troy for Cal OES, filling in for Ryan Puris. Good afternoon, everybody. We'll go ahead and walk through a little bit on some of the different options available under the California Disaster Assistance Act that can supplement some of the programs that have just been discussed in the last couple of presentations. While CDAA and Cal OES are not a primary or lead partner when it comes to drought, we are tasked with coordination of response to disasters and coordination and recovery of disasters in the state of California under the Standardized Emergency Management System. So most of you in the county know that you all have the operational area construct and have that job for coordination at the county level. And then of course, with our Cal OES response partners to work with all the different directorates within Cal OES to see how we can support when it comes to drought. Next slide, please. So, good news is that on October 19th in 2021, the governor expanded the statewide drought emergency to include all 58 counties and to make temporary emergency water supply and delivery for drinking water for sanitation purposes eligible for assistance under CDAA. So that expanded the ability for us to be able to use CDAA to help with recovery from drought. Next slide, please. So this slide, which will be made available, highlights the overall process. So at the top, you'll see that the jurisdictions need temporary emergency supply delivery or both of drinking water or water for sanitation purposes, and they seek funding through through DWR or Water Resources Control Board, and you need to go to them first, right? The programs that have just been described and outlined really are the primary tools when it comes to dealing with drought and are the necessary first step to see what can be done to help with your operational area. Really encourage you all to engage with them sooner rather than later, because as Megan noted, a lot of these things take time. And the last place we want to be is where there's a desperate need and there could have been assistance available if we'd connected earlier. So really encourage that. But if no funding is available through DWR or the water boards, then resource requests can be submitted through the State Operations Center, and with approval from the State Department of Finance can be fulfilled. And so those would be requests for different types of direct state assistance from state partners to help within those two parameters that were outlined within the state drought emergency, and they're limited to that. So it's a pretty narrow tool. It's a tool in the toolbox, but it is definitely not a comprehensive tool that can solve all of the problems or the needs here. If no approval through the SOC or DOF exists, then the local jurisdictions can use local funding to go ahead and meet those needs and then submit afterwards an initial damage estimate up through the state with the cost and make a request for potential reimbursement under CDAA to the Cal OES Recovery Directorate. And as part of that, then the Recovery Directorate prepares an issue brief, which is then put forth to the Cal OES Director and to the Governor's office for review and decision. And then ultimately a decision is made, and then the local jurisdiction is made aware of what the determination is. Next slide, please. But a few things I'd like to point out when it comes to the eligibility under CDAA, it really is limited to that temporary emergency water supply and delivery for drinking water and for sanitation. So it's only for those uses, not for any type of permanent work or permanent infrastructure. It is to reiterate, it is a reimbursement mechanism. So only for costs that have already been incurred using local funding. There is a cost share of 75-25, and that's another good reason that where you can take advantage of the other programs that have been identified, they're frequently going to be the better course of action. There's also no guarantee that there'll be a reimbursement. There are a number of factors that are taken into consideration when reviewing those requests. Some of those include the fiscal capabilities and impacts to local budgets, and also whether or not the capacities or capabilities of the jurisdiction have been exceeded or not. And one of the things that we look at is the indicator for each of the counties, which is $4.10 per resident. So that's the indicators and thresholds we use in alignment with FEMA programs. And so there are a lot of hurdles there and no guarantee. So we really encourage you to make those connections early with your DWR and water board partners. Some examples of ineligible costs are income fee, revenue, lost wages or rents because of any waivers or any loss of revenue, or any activities or costs associated with permanent work are also not eligible for reimbursement currently under CDAA. And any distribution of water to businesses or the private sector is also not eligible. The narrative there, goes through some additional detail on just submission of those different costs or projects via the SOC. Each of your counties has a Cal OES response emergency services coordinator assigned to them. If you need to know who that is, you can just drop a question into the chat and we can make sure that that coordinator makes a connection with you in the county so you know who that you should be talking to. And they really are your primary voice when it comes to engaging and coordinating with the state family in support of drought on the OES side. So if you don't know who they are, we also encourage you to take advantage of that as well. So with that, I'll pause there to see if we have any questions from anybody.
All right. It looks like Andrew Lockman raised his hand. I'm going to go ahead and give you permission and ask you to unmute yourself, Andrew.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Apologize, that took a second for the permission. Good afternoon, Andrew Lockman, Tulare County Office of Emergency Services. I think this is a great opportunity. Thank you for the presentation, been very informative. Just kind of something I wanted to put out there and see if anybody could comment to between DWR, Waterboard, and Cal OES. One of the challenges that we're seeing here is a little bit of kind of some holes in the safety net that's being described here. We have a great arrangement with self-help for systems with under 1,000 population served. We're aware of some of the assistance to water systems. Really what we're getting concerned about is the systems with 3,000 plus connections that are also experiencing some challenges or vulnerability. We're also getting concerned with constraints around the bottled water supply as expressed by some of the bottlers. So we're trying to pursue funding or some mechanism to prepare for that, get a cash in place, et cetera. But we haven't found any of these funding vehicles available. And the response that we're getting from both of the funding agencies is that would fall outside of their scope and become an OES problem. We've run that up through our ESC. It's gone into EEIs and Cal ESC and all that sort of stuff, but we're not really hearing anything back. So I'm starting to get a little bit nervous here, having been ground zero of the last drought. I'm hopefully not repeating that honor, but I'd love to hear what anybody's thoughts are on how we might be able to better leverage some of these funding sources to get a cash going, get a little bit more in front of this. Thank you.
Andrew, could you clarify what those costs were for? You said for the over 10,000, I believe, but what were the actual costs or impacts that you're saying?
So what we're trying to do is contingency plan for populations of 15 or 20,000 individuals that might find themselves out of water concurrently on little to no notice. So our projection on that would be $4 or $5 million. Obviously, we can talk CDAA offline, but there's a reservation about investing in a contingency cache of a resource that may never get used at a local expense with no expectation of reimbursement at this point. But recognizing that need will probably exist, and there may be a statewide shortage on bottled water. So we're just trying to navigate that one a little bit. And so far, the fingers keep pointing back to Cal OES. I just wanted to see if we can adjudicate that here a little bit better.
Sure, and I don't want to speak for for water boards or DWR, and certainly turn to them if they want to chime in with any other thoughts. But on the OES side, yeah, unfortunately, that would definitely not be eligible under CDA within those type parameters that I mentioned, right? It can only be for actually incurred costs, and it has to be related to the temporary water supply and the actual the cost incurred for the delivery of that and the temporary measures. So unfortunately, that would not be eligible under CDA. However, that being said, there might be some opportunities on the mitigation side of the house. I can't speak to that with certainty, but Andrew, I certainly have your contact information, and I can connect with our mitigation folks and circle back with you on that to see if there would be any opportunities for planning grants to assist with that effort.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. In the meantime, then I think we'll probably just plan on mission tasking the state if we end up in a large system failure that we don't have an adequate cash on hand for. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Oh, looks like you're on mute, Robert.
Yep. Or if there aren't any other questions, Molly, it looks like I think Paul is next. Is that correct?
Yep, let's go ahead and move on. I'm not seeing another hands up. All
Okay.
right. Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you and good afternoon. I'm Paul Gosling. I'm Deputy Director at the Department of Water Resources at the Sustainable Groundwater Management Office. So what I'm going to cover today is information about Executive Order Action 9 related to well permitting during droughts. And I should begin by saying this is not necessarily a DWR program. It's not a program that the state is enforcing. We're here to describe answers to what the intent is and information on some of the things that we've learned and answered questions since it was put in place in March 28th. I do want to thank you all. I think a number of you joined on a county webinar call in April on this executive order action. We learned a lot of questions, and as I'll point out later, a lot of the information from that webinar, two-pager and frequently asked questions that had just been developed is now available. So as we go through, I hope we'll be able to address a lot of the questions that have come up, but I know there's probably more. And if I don't say at the end, I do want to afford the opportunity and that if you do need a briefing with the county or local agencies, and we're open and willing to do that to keep the dialogue going on how to make this work. Next slide, please. So, this provision of the executive order is somewhat different than what's been seen in other executive orders. So we do recognize that the timing on this, the immediacy of it was difficult, especially with the workload that's existing in now county environmental health offices and other well permitting agencies and the groundwater sustainability agencies. But as you heard, this drought is really creating unprecedented circumstances that's going to require some new thinking, new tools, and new actions to stem some of the impacts that we have seen in the past and that we can anticipate based upon our knowledge as to what's going to occur. And two of those that have been occurring, routine drought impacts, come from increased subsidence and dry wells. And again, the demand on groundwater during droughts increases, and it's really exacerbated in areas where groundwater management may not be suitable to withstand the impacts of droughts. So what we've seen during the last drought and even recently the last 2 years was areas of the state where increased subsidence occurred and placing great strain and difficulty and risk to infrastructure, levees, conveyance, roads, gas lines, as well as dry wells, community wells, domestic wells in the hundreds and thousands during droughts. And the nature of the executive order, which I'll get into, is to also try to minimize these impacts. And again, as we've heard, we were expecting these impacts to occur, and with the state and local agency response, this is also going to drive a lot of workload at the local level and the state in response to these. So although this has presented a new workload and some uncertainty about how to navigate this, it's really intended to take a pause and looking at the issuance of wells during the drought to hopefully stem the tide of some of these more severe impacts. Next slide, please. So I think many of you have seen the language in the executive order. It was written to deal with two things. One is the relationship between the well permitting agency and the groundwater sustainability agency, and then also consideration for impacts to dry wells and areas that are susceptible to subsidence. I'm going to move past this slide. The language, I think, is not very direct, but it has created confusion. So I'll go to the next slide. So really just breaking down all that language, it ties into new wells or alterations to existing wells. And all of the actions for both 9A and 9B largely are placed on the county well permitting agency. They're the ones, the responsibility for issuing well permits, and this action, both 9A and B, are about considerations prior to issuing a well permit. So questions, starting with the questions about what types of wells or what types of well activities, really it comes down because every county is different. The executive order was written broadly to reflect the diversity of resolutions that counties have on well permitting. So it really comes down to if a county is issuing a permit or requires a permit for certain activities, these apply. So, and again, both for the county well permitting agency or the GSA, the executive order does not change responsibilities or shift responsibilities between the two agencies. It's intended to keep everyone in their lanes with their existing authority and working through these two provisions. I will also say too, as I get into the details of it, it's not a ban on well permits, nor should it be considered that it's expected that things will continue as business as usual. It really is intended to pause and have some consideration about whether wells being permitted at this time during the worst drought of our lifetimes should be delayed in circumstances where there's a likelihood of dry wells or increased subsidence. Now, it doesn't mean that once the executive order is lifted, that the permittee could have their well permit issued and continue about their business. I will say it does not apply to domestic wells, which are called de minimis users, less than 2 acre-feet per year, or public water supply systems solely relied on groundwater. So again, the executive order is temporary. It's not a regulation or statute. There was questions about whether CEQA was required. This is something I think within the counties you'll need to confer with county council. We do not believe CEQA is required. And again, it's not intended to be prescriptive. We intended it to be broad and flexible and adaptive to what local county conditions are considering and how the process works locally. So what applies? It's any well permit that was issued or considered after March 28th. If permits were issued prior to March 28th, somebody has a well permit that was issued by the county and they're waiting to have the drill rig come out, yes, they can continue that well permit. It doesn't go retroactive. So if somebody got a well permit prior to March 28th, they can get the well drilling continued. And I'll talk right now about 9A, and this involves consultation with the groundwater sustainability prior to issuing a well permit. And this is, again, the county well permitting agency consulting with the local groundwater agency in any of the high and medium priority basins. So that's throughout the state, the areas subject to the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. This consultation is consistent with the statutes that were passed when SGMA was passed, both in the government code and the water code, that really drives both the land use agency and well permitting agencies to interact and confer with the groundwater sustainability agency and vice versa. So what the intent of this is that the well permitting agency would, if they're in a high and medium priority basin, would confer with their groundwater sustainability agency and receive written verification from the Groundwater Sustainability Agency that the permit's consistent with the Groundwater Sustainability Plan and the sustainability goals. Now, this written verification can be, simple or as complicated as the local agencies decide. Really, the whole intent is to bring that dialogue between the local agencies together to confer. So if there are issues, let's say with the Groundwater Sustainability Agency that may have pumping limits or allocations, that's going to be important information. Or if it's an area that was never considered as part of the sustainability plan to be groundwater dependent, and it was a new area going in, it really would get those agencies to confer and coordinate on basin management. And again, the requirement, it's not intended that the Groundwater Sustainability Agency would have to do extensive analysis. It's a qualitative call whether that well permit is consistent with the plan. We've heard from many counties and agencies where they do have existing relationships now on well permitting with that communication, and that would probably suffice that to meet this, that communication is going on. Also, there's many counties that are either the GSA or part of a GSA, and that communication should be linked in very well. So 9A, again, is the county well permitting agency conferring with the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, and the Groundwater Sustainability Agency providing written verification to the well permitting agency that it's consistent with the plan and the sustainability goals. Now 9B, and I will say both for the well permitting agencies, the County Environmental Health, both 9A and B apply. So if you're in a basin, high, medium priority basin, 9A and 9B apply. 9B applies in any area of the jurisdiction, whether it's in a basin or outside of a basin, high, medium, or low, very low priority basin. This consideration in 9B has to be taken into account. It probably would have been better to have them switched because 9B is broader. So again, this is really intended to have the well permitting agency pause, consider where the location of this well is going in. And as you heard earlier, a lot of the information and tools that are being developed really can help inform whether the area is of high risk to subsidence or high risk of having dry wells. And I think a lot of local information, also your own experience going through the past year drought and the previous droughts on where those areas are. So again, it was means that it's not a permanent ban. So we've heard from some counties where they're actually processing permits, holding them until the executive order is lifted. Some have considered conditionally approving the well permit once the executive order is lifted. So that's really the intent. So a lot of this has to really, I think, reflect the information that we provide and the local discretion on how to consider those well permitting information. Next slide, please. So a couple things as you heard, and I won't go through this extensively because many of these tools that you've heard earlier are up and available. And I think especially if you go to Cal Groundwater Live, as Stephen Springhorn described, that new Drywell vulnerability tool could help inform local agency decisions about whether they should consider issuing the well at this time, especially in those areas that are highly vulnerable to dry wells or subsidence. And again, there's a suite of information that we have available. And again, I think a lot of information and experience you have locally can help inform some of the decisions you have to make for well permits in these areas. I should also point out on the website, we can go to the next slide, please. We do have information available, and in addition to this, we'll have a newly prepared frequently asked questions that was really based upon a lot of the dialogue we've had with some counties, with some local agencies, and from the county webinar last April. So it does cover a number of the questions that have come up, and one common one is, many basins have plans that have been deemed incomplete. DWR has not approved plans, or there's been a number of plans that were submitted in January of this year, and we're in the process of reviewing and approving. Groundwater sustainability plans are actionable and are being implemented once the local agency adopts them. So irregardless of the status of our approval process, they are operational, and the local agency can review them in light of this executive order and help make that determination. So that was one important point of the frequently asked questions. So with that, I think we can go to the next slide. And I think we can open up for questions before we go to Eric.
Thanks, Paul. Does anyone have any questions at this point?
Okay, well, thank you. And again, if there are counties or local agencies or combinations that would like to have a briefing or ask specific questions, we're available. We've been able to do that in various locations around the state. So looking forward to working with you all. Now I'd like to turn over to our colleague, Eric Zaninga from State Water Board, Division of Drinking Water, who is going to talk about water hauling. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And like you mentioned, my name is Eric Zuniga. I'm the Drought Response Program Manager for the Division of Drinking Water at the State Water Resources Control Board. And I really appreciate the rapid fire nature of the presentations from my colleagues so far today. My presentation is also short and sweet. It's intended to highlight one required action from Executive Order N722, as previously mentioned. So let's go to the next slide, please. So first, I wanted to provide a little bit of background comments on the Division of Drinking Water's general stance on hauled water. First of all, it's not an appropriate long-term source of water for any public water system or community. It's really intermittent in nature by the nature of the truck deliveries, and it's more prone to contamination than our traditional water supplies that we approve for public water systems. So it's really not considered a reliable permanent source by any means. We would basically have to take a lot of additional safeguards to ensure that if any water system is using hauled water, that they're using it appropriately so as to minimize any such risk that I mentioned. However, it can and continues to be used for emergency situations when a water system has run out of water for reasons such as fire, earthquake, or in this case, drought impacts. The county regional hauling programs, as previously mentioned, allow for reimbursement by the state of these hauled water usages for domestic wells and small communities. So I think that was important to note, as mentioned before, that we do have something in place for that. And as mentioned by Cal OES, I also wanted to remind folks to track all expenses due to drought, including hauled water, so we can continue to track statewide financial drought impacts. So on March 28, 2022 is when the executive order was signed, and this is Action 7 related to hauled water. Next slide, please. So I'm breaking down this action into two general parts, and basically the intent of the action is to streamline the delivery of hauled water from many potential sources to the many communities and domestic well users that are experiencing a dry well or have degraded water quality from drought conditions by ensuring that there are no regulatory barriers in place for this emergency response effort. So the first part suspends any ordinance, regulation, prohibition, policy, or requirement of any kind adopted by a public agency that prohibits water going out of a basin or jurisdiction. So for example, there's a lot of counties and cities and public entities such as groundwater sustainability agencies that may have restrictions currently in place to maintain water within their boundaries or groundwater basins, for example. So this would apply also to any state entity requirements for any prior approvals for such transfers. Next slide, please. So the second part is indicating that the scope of this suspension is limited to hauling or bottled water for health and human safety needs, such as human consumption, cooking, or sanitation for communities and residences. So it's not intended to allow hauling for other uses, such as agricultural or potentially cannabis use, whether legal or illegal. It was not intended to cover those situations. This is strictly for human health and safety needs. Finally, the last part, your county environmental health services departments and California Department of Public Health Food and Drug Branch might have certain safety standards for the delivery of hauled water that would need to be adhered to. So we obviously, as we're delivering water, we don't want to make the situation any worse by providing any substandard water supplies. Next slide, which concludes my presentation. If there are no questions, I will turn it over to Fethi Benjamin from DWR to talk about any upcoming activities related to SB552.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Fethi Benjamin with DWR's Water Use Efficiency Branch. You've heard the term SB552 a few times already today. It was mentioned by my colleagues, Steve, Art, and Megan. SB552, signed by Governor Newsom in September 2021, includes requirements aiming to improve drought and water shortage planning and preparedness and resiliency for small suppliers and rural communities statewide. This bill includes shortage planning requirements pertaining to these three main groups. One, small water suppliers, those with less than 3,000 connections. These requirements are also pertinent to water systems that are schools. The second group is counties, which I will talk more about today. And the third group, the bill identifies responsibilities for state agencies, namely the State Water Board and the Department of Water Resources. In fact, we, DWR and the State Board, have just released jointly in the past few days a primer, an SB552 primer, that gives high-level summary of the legislation. And hot off the press, it was just posted like 20 minutes ago on DWR's website. I will put a link to the webpage on the chat, and I believe Molly is going to be uploading a PDF of the document in the chat as well. So as I said, the primer explains and highlights the various specific requirements pertaining to each one of these three groups. Next, please. Let me quickly zoom in on the responsibilities pertaining to counties. And then I will go over state support and assistance plan to help counties implement those requirements. Two main requirements for the counties that SB552 requires. One, each county shall establish a standing county drought and water shortage task force. This task force is meant to facilitate drought and water shortage preparedness for state smalls and for domestic wells within the county jurisdiction. Just for the sake of defining things, state smalls means those smaller small water systems, and specifically those serving 5 to 14 service connections. The legislation does give some flexibility, and in lieu of a task force as required, a county might or may implement an alternative process that facilitates drought and water shortage preparedness for state smalls and for domestic wells within the county's jurisdiction. The second requirement is for each county to develop a plan that includes potential drought and water shortage risk and proposed interim and long-term solutions for, again, state small water systems and for domestic wells within the county's jurisdiction. The plan also here, there is some flexibility in the legislation. The plan may be a standalone document, a standalone plan, or elements may be included in various existing county plans, such as a local hazard mitigation plan, an emergency operations plan, a climate action plan, or the general plan. So what's the state assistance, or what type of state assistance is available for counties to implement SB552 requirements? Next, please. As you see here, at various stages, and as counties initially assess the shortage risk for their communities, then develop a plan, including establishing task forces or other processes to facilitate preparedness and response, and also in the final stage of implementing some of the water shortage response programs and actions, and even sometimes undertake emergency response. Along the way, and at all of these three stages, there is state assistance. There are existing planned programs, existing programs and planned programs. My colleagues talked about some of those already. We have assistance in terms of data and tools to help with the risk assessment stage. For example, several tools that were mentioned earlier. My colleague Stephen Springhorn did go over some of those. We have the water shortage risk explorer and vulnerability tool for small systems and for domestic wells and state smalls. This was developed as part of the CDAG process, which preceded SB552 requirements. Other tools, as I said, presented include the California Water Watch. It gives maps of current and forecasted supply conditions. The Groundwater Live presented by Steve, that gives latest groundwater information and conditions, and many other tools. Now, in addition to technical assistance, we are also looking at financial assistance and providing funding for implementing drought and response actions. We've heard about funding programs earlier. In addition, DWR is considering some sort of financial assistance to counties to implement SB552 planning requirements, and how to we are considering on how to avail the expected funding coming our way, funding that Art mentioned earlier, whether in the form of local assistance directly to counties, or in the form of directed assistance through third-party entities such as nonprofits or even consultants. So to help us better match DWR's assistance with the needs of the counties, we have launched recently a survey for counties to tell us what type of assistance could be most useful for them. I have, let me put a link in the chat for that survey, along with a link to a first of a series of 4 workshops that we are planning. Now, for the planning, we are looking into developing a guidebook. And this guidebook is meant to assist counties on how to do their plans. A work group will be formed to help with the development of this guidance and guidebook. And we are planning for ample opportunity for you to give and provide input and feedback. So your input is critical in developing the guidebook that is relevant and most helpful for you. Needless to emphasize, please do respond to the survey. Help us help you. Basically, we would like to know what type of state assistance could be most useful for the counties. Again, join and participate in the guidebook development. Attend and participate in the upcoming workshops. The next workshop is scheduled for June 2nd. It will give an overview, and then we will go more in details about the parts of the guidebook and hopefully finalize the guidebook by late fall. Again, I have a link to the June 2nd workshop in the chat. Next, please. So last, I have here my colleague Julie Ekstrom's contact information. She is our lead on SB552. I'm sure most or many of you have already heard from or interacted with her. I have also here and in the chat DWR's SB552 web link. And that concludes my presentation. If there is any questions. And thank you. I hand it back to Mon.
Thank you, Fethi. I'm not seeing any hands up right now. There is a question in the Q&A about will all the links shared in the chat be emailed out. All of these are in the presentation itself. We'll double check on that and make sure that all of those are available because there was a lot of information shared today. Okay, so we'll do one final call for questions. I know this has been a lot of information to take in. And once again, we really appreciate you all being here today, for being our partners in addressing drought impacts, and for helping get water to folks who need it this summer. All right, so seeing none, I think we will go ahead and end a little bit early today. And once again, all of the content from today, including the recording and the slides with all of the links, will be posted to the funding solicitation page. So that'll be early next week at the latest. Ryan, looks like you have something to add?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I was just noticing the email address in this slide. I think that might be incorrect for Julie Ekstrom, so I posted her email address in the chat if anybody is interested in emailing her.
Great, we'll make sure we correct that in the final version of the slides.
Thank you, Ryan.
All right, well, thanks again, everyone. Hope you have a lovely afternoon and we will be in touch with you soon. Have a great day.